in March. I believe Lynn McTaggart will be there with us also, and we're going to do a water healing ceremony in Japanese form, and then healing on the waters, and see what effects we can bring about for the water system there in the country of Japan.
Well, this is all connected with what you do, too. That's what's so amazing. And different offshoots, perhaps, but it's all connected. Now, reconnective healing is what you call what you do. Mm-hmm. How did this come about? How did you name it reconnective healing, and what happened as you begin to kick this into high gear now?
How do we name it reconnective healing? Okay, here we go.
Some people call it hands-on healing. You're not hands-on healing, so...
This is hands-off.
This is hands-off
really
healing, that's right.
This is off the body. Reconnective healing started one day in August of 1993. In short form, I was a chiropractor, and somewhere in my 12th year of practice, a few strange things happened, and a light turned itself on next to my bed and woke me up. I felt people in my house. I went looking for them with a nice can of pepper spray, my Doberman. Yeah. I couldn't find anybody. I went back to sleep. Monday, I went into my office, and 7 of my patients started telling me that they felt my hands on them before I touched them, and other patients were telling me that they felt people standing and walking and running and flying around in the room. Now, I had practiced for 12 years. No one had ever said this to me before, so it caught my attention, shall we say.
Yes.
And, of course, that's the background story that most of us know. I continued working with this, playing with it with my hands. My palms blistered a couple of times, and my palm bled once, not like a stigmata, but, more like you stick it with a pin or a needle. And the next thing you know, the healing started happening, people getting up out of wheelchairs, and vision and hearing returning, and patients reporting cancers vanishing. And no, it didn't happen with everyone, but it happened with a lot of people, enough so that we began to recognize that something substantial was occurring, and that's when people started asking if I could teach this, and that's when I started saying, I don't know how to teach this because I'm standing there waving my hands in the air looking like an idiot, so wave your hands in the air, look like an idiot, and let me know what happens. But my patients would call and say that when they got home, they walked into their house and their lamp or television or stereo started turning on and off and on and off, and they felt sensations in their hands. They would hold their hands near someone in their family, and those people would start having healings too, and that's how we began to recognize that once you interact with this new, what science calls a more comprehensive spectrum of healing that takes us beyond energy, it seems to activate something, whether it's receptors in us, as Art Bell used to say, or whether it's a level of awareness in us, as I tend to think that it is, or a combination thereof. But that's the beginning portion of accessing this. And, of course, that is strange enough to some people, but what you're asking me is about a yet stranger portion of this story, which was approximately 4 months into this, a patient of mine came in who had been a patient for for a year and a half, but he disappeared, from my practice for about 6 months, and he wasn't around when this started.
Okay.
He came back in expecting to see his same chiropractor, and something else was going on. So I placed him on a table, and I held my hands near him, and his head jerked back, and his eyes rolled, and his mouth opened, and his tongue moved, and air suddenly came out of his mouth and formed a sort of a squeaky sound which condensed itself into a voice. And he said, "We are here to tell you to continue doing what you were doing. What you were doing is bringing light and information onto the planet." And I know that I've told this story in much more detail in some of your archives, which is why I'm condensing it a little bit now. Mm-hmm. But as you may recall, 2 days later it happened to 3 other patients, and a few days later it happened to 5 other patients. And during this 3-month period from January of 1994 through middle of April of 1994, over 50 different patients lost consciousness and spoke 6 verbatim phrases. Now, the first 4 were, "We are here to tell you to continue doing what you were doing. What you were doing is bringing light and information onto the planet. What you were doing is reconnecting strings. What you were doing is reconnecting strands." Now, all that aside, as people found out about the work, people started saying, well, can you come teach a little here and teach a little there? And I started to get my feet, wet by speaking to 25 people here or 45 people there, and somewhere in L.A. and somewhere in Hawaii and somewhere in Philadelphia or Jersey or New York and somewhere in Miami. And so as I started to do this, the one question everyone always had was, what do you call this? And I said, it doesn't have a name. It doesn't have a name. Well, it has to have a name. And I said, well, actually, no, it doesn't. And they said, well, yeah, you have to call it something. And I said, well, you can't, because once you call it something, it's like giving it a box, putting it into a box. You say, this is what it is, and this is what it isn't. And I don't know what it is yet, but even what I'm more certain of is we don't know what it isn't. So I don't want to give it a name. But human nature just couldn't stand that. And suddenly I'd find that flyers and mailers were going out to people saying, Dr. Eric Pearl is coming and he's going to teach Pearl healing technique or Pearl high energy technique or new frequency technique or deep natural healing technique. Everyone was giving it a different name, which was worse than it having no name. So I finally thought I have to come up with a name, and I'm trying to come up with all these clever names. You know how everyone's coming up with, alpha, beta, delta, gamma this, and quantum that, and everyone's going to have some kind of a new kicky name for their energy healing techniques, and this was so much more than energy. And every name I came up with, I created little mnemonics from the initials, and all, but nothing made sense, and finally I knew I had to come up with something fast, at least just temporary, until I had time to really think of a good name for it. And so I looked at those 6 phrases, and the third and fourth ones were, what you're doing is reconnecting strings, and what you're doing is reconnecting strands. Right, so I thought, well, I'll just temporarily use that for name. I sent out one mailer, and all of a sudden, thousands of people started calling and saying, as soon as I heard the name, I knew what this was supposed to be, and I had to be there. And I suddenly realized that when we reconnect to our original fullness, that is not a static state. When we reconnect to who we are as spirit, as physical being and spiritual being, it is something that is always expanding, as if you drop a pearl into a beautiful still pond of water, and the ripples continue out and expand and expand and expand. And so we can reconnect without it having to be a box, because it neither defines it nor limits it. And that's where I got the name from.
Do you believe this ability is given to you, or are there helpers out there, like these entities that spoke through others, but are they giving you this ability?
I believe that those who speak to us are giving us the guidance to recognize our own ability to access a more comprehensive universe. I believe that our fear, lack, and limitation causes us to then think that these are helpers helping us with the healing, because we are afraid that we cannot do it ourselves, and hopefully we will find the point that we can recognize it, because the universe always says yes. And when we feel that we need guides or helpers, spirits, whatever, to help us do the healing, then we are telling ourselves that we are less than 100%. Because if we are 100%, then there's nothing we can add. No. Let's do a visual on this.
Hold on there, Eric. We're at the top of the hour. We'll be right back with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM.